The Functional Economy, The Bases of Economic Organization by Bernard W. Dempsey, S.J. Chapter 5, Medieval Economic Organization. Medieval economic control is an open contrast to that of modern society in almost every important respect. Modern control, though very real and widespread, is largely private, and therefore piecemeal. It is accidental, devious, and not always fully conscious of the scope of its actions. Even in those cases where action is public and direct, as with tariffs, for example, modern control is aware of its inconsistency and is accordingly apologetic and loquacious. In medieval society, on the other hand, control was public and unblushing. It was, in many respects, complete and always purposeful. Little was left to accident. Because medieval control was barefaced and in the open, its sources are usually clear, and its growth may be observed as it extends itself by a greater and greater participation of those on lower economic levels in an authority that, though administered from above, has its roots in the whole community. Modern control usually enters the industrial world obliquely, through the side door, or is handed by politics to economics to be received without recourse. This contrast is valid, of course, only for an economy conducted on Victorian lines. It is not apposite in those countries that, despairing of automatic adjustment, have turned to arbitrary one-man rule, which has nothing whatever in common with medieval economic government on the plan of justice and law. The nature of control. Control is a species of government, and government, as we have seen, is the harmonious direction of affairs to their proper end. Direction is mostly positive, not negative only, and implies impulse as well as restraint. Providence was the principle of both human and divine government, but providence requires as part of its plan the intelligent cooperation of creatures in the divine design. Men must use their heads, working together in attaining both their temporal and eternal ends. Not before the Enlightenment could men place their faith in an invisible guiding hand that required no human cooperation. Such magical effects would not satisfy the medieval rationalist. For a given phenomenon, he required an adequate explanation. To attain a given end, intelligent effort was required. The economic bonum commune was such an end. Therefore, its attainment called for intelligent effort. Ends are attained through order, not through chaos or competition. So the medieval world set about determining who could and should do what to attain this end, the common weal. The guild, the organ of control in the Middle Ages. The principal organ through which this intelligently cooperative effort to attain the common good expressed itself was the guild. The guild was a European affair throughout the entire Middle Ages, a fact that the intensive study of the English guilds had tended to obscure. The word guild itself appears in several languages, but there were also universitates, collegia, caritates, gremios, mestas, mestieri, corporation des métiers, confrérie, Innungen, Amte, Zunfte, fraternitates, freries, scuole, arti, hanses. The guild is the economic institution par excellence, an accepted way of doing things manifest in every part of Western Europe and applied to almost every form of social activity. Association, deliberate and conscious, was a universal medieval phenomenon, a vital, organic institution, plastic, responsive to the needs of time, place, and circumstance. For this reason, if for no other, the facts that history teaches us about guild life shade imperceptibly into probability and conjecture. Generalizations must be taken as against such a background, realizing that we are dealing with an institution not superimposed by a modern omnipotent government, but growing out of a common religious outlook, not always perfectly grasped, and, as it were, spontaneously out of the thoughtful effort of freemen to direct to their proper end the things that make for bread, that is, to govern their economic life. The parochialism of the guilds. Universal though the guild might be as a social phenomenon, concretely it was a distinctly local affair. Nationalism, as we have it, was unknown in the Middle Ages, and guild economy was almost exclusively communal in structure and outlook. Some merchant guilds naturally had concerns over distant matters, and thus would associate themselves with other foreign merchants for the purchase of supplies and for their transport. But the guild of each group remained entirely an affair of the men of the hometown. Goods were sold in a market which was local in scope and regulated by local authority, for the benefit of fellow citizens only. However warm might be the hospitality bestowed upon pilgrim or wandering clerk, in matters of business a cold reserve awaited the foreigner, though he might be from a city but 100 miles away. Bearing in mind the solidarity which prevailed in all Europe on the intellectual and religious plane, this economic isolation furnishes us with a strange paradox. The same Thomas Aquinas, sojourner in Paris, Rome, Naples, and Cologne, who could lecture to clerics from all parts of a real Christendom in their universal Latin, could also write for the instruction of the young king of Cyprus. Now, intercourse with foreigners, according to Aristotle's Politics, is particularly harmful to civic customs. It follows inevitably that strangers brought up under other laws and customs will, in many cases, act as the citizens are not wont to act, and thus, since the citizens are drawn by their example to act likewise, their own civic life is upset. Prevailing physical conditions of transport and communication made this aloofness toward the unknown foreigner as much an effect of a real isolation as the cause of further isolation. The origins of the guilds. Of the origins of the guilds, no single satisfactory explanation or hypothesis is tenable, nor probably ever will be. The collegia of Roman artisans, the extension of Christian societies into economic activities, Anglo-Saxon frith guilds or fraternal associations, German banqueting or drinking societies, the example of the religious communities, the natural expansion of the family economy with the extension of the scope of economic activity, all of these have been brought forward singly or in groups to explain the appearance of the guild system. Most of the exclusive, definitive explanations are highly tendentious, however. It is a simple and more realistic attitude to be satisfied with the fact that there was in Europe a way of life accepted by all which made association natural, easy, and permanent, and that there was a concrete economic problem of filling the needs of daily life, which would most intelligently be met by association. This much is certainly true. If in any particular area pagan institutions were with this new leaven quickened, or if surviving Roman institutions were revitalized by this religious factor in the new economic complex, the facts are not exclusive but complementary. Once the system existed in well-defined form, the successful guild was imitated, just as over 350 communal charters show the influence of Rouen, Breteuil, and Beaumont, so those guild charters that experience had approved were studied and copied. From Siena to York, in the writing of the rules of the guilds, the same formula can be found. If anyone shall presume to do thus and so, an ancient canonical formula as old as ecclesiastical law. For the rest, we may well take our stand with the good men of Stratford-on-Avon, who, in 1381, when asked to give an account of their guilds, stated that their origins were back to a point, whereunto the memory of man reacheth not. We must take the guilds as we find them, as going concerns. 3 aspects of the guilds. The pervasive religious element makes them difficult, if not impossible, to classify neatly, and chronological categories that do not strain the facts are not easily constructed. In good medieval terminology, guild is an analogous term predicated of things that are the same under one aspect but different under another. For convenience, we will treat them in 3 overlapping divisions: religious guilds, merchant guilds, and craft guilds. Of the first, little need be said. They were organized among the laity for liturgical, devotional, charitable, and social purposes. They were common to all Europe, and few townspeople would not have belonged to some such organization. Their objects included participation in the liturgy, mutual aid, help of the poor, the sick, the aged, prisoners, and strangers, the burial of the dead, provision of dowries for bride and novice, maintenance of schools, and social and recreational activities. As instruments of economic control, the merchant guild and the craft guild here occupy our attention, but they are not entirely distinct from the religious associations. Religious groups did not necessarily have an economic purpose. but the economic corporations, both merchant and craft, never excluded the religious. In point of time, the religious societies are the oldest, but new ones continued to come into being long after merchant guilds had been flourishing throughout Europe, and after the craft guilds had established their independent status, merchant guilds continued to appear. For the most part, craft and merchant guilds were quite distinct in Europe by the middle of the 13th century. Before that time, however, this was not always true, and exceptions remain. The growth and power of the guilds. Although merchant guilds existed in southern Europe for at least a century and a half earlier, they become clearly discernible as a general institution early in the 12th century, associations of freemen of a town, enjoying a monopoly of trade over a given area, and having the right, within the limits of their charters, to legislate concerning the conduct of transactions, hours of market, terms of payment, grades of goods, and similar matters. The rise of the merchant guilds is cognate to the rise of the free communes and the establishment of urban independence. Both are part of the same movement. Almost certainly the guild had a de facto existence as a free association before the town was chartered, but the formal existence of the guild as a juridical entity was always dependent upon the act of some public authority. Though the guild regulations were binding upon all, only the town corporation had power over the guild. No single formula suffices to describe the relation of town and guild corporation except that it was always intimate. The guild promoted trade by creating wharfs, ports, market halls, roads, canals, and by arranging commercial agreements, caravans, and armed escorts. Weights and measures were supervised by the town corporation or the feudal lord, but the task might be delegated to the guild. By the right of staple, goods in transit were subjected to an option of the local authorities, and by this means local people were guaranteed food and raw materials. Sometimes, as at Liège after 1384, town and guild were identified. At Florence, Zurich, and Strasbourg, the merchants' corporation had privileges concerning the nomination of town councilmen. In theory, the guild corporation was distinct from the town corporation and subordinate to it. In practice, they tended to become more or less identified, at least in personnel, certainly in sympathy. In Bologna, Siena, Bruges, Spires, Worms, Ulm, Mayence, and Marseille, the guild had a greater or lesser voice in specifically municipal affairs. The dominant preoccupation of both town and guild was the promotion of the common prosperity by orderly use of their newfound and sometimes dearly bought freedom. As in the case of town charters, feudal authority had granted the early guild charters for a variety of reasons: for public utility, out of concern for the common good, for convenience, in exchange for definite services past or future, to avoid trouble with a class that was fast attaining a power that had to be reckoned with, or as a result of open and bloody revolt of that same aggressive power. What the merchants wanted is clear from what they got, that no foreign merchant buy within the city from a foreigner corn, hides, or wool, except from a citizen, that no foreigner sell cloth at retail in the city, that no foreign merchant tarry in the city with his merchandise to sell it except for 40 days, also that all reasonable persons have their guild. Dublin, A.D. 1192. We decree that our townsmen of Dordrecht may enjoy in their own right the following freedom of the said town, namely that it is permitted to no one in Dordrecht to cut cloth for retail sale except to those who are designated by this trade, and except they be in the Hansa and fraternity of the townsmen belonging to Dordrecht. Theodore, Count of Holland, A.D. 1200. I have also granted this liberty to them, that if any one shall come into that place, the Guildhall, wheresoever he may have committed an offence, my judge shall not be allowed to arrest him in that hall. We have added this too, that no foreign merchant shall ever sell or expose his goods for sale except in that hall or its appendages or in the open market. Theodore, Count of Flanders, to St. Omer, A.D. 1151. Also, no vessel from all Normandy may ship to Ireland except from Rouen, except in one case where it is permitted to ship from Cherbourg once a year. Henry, Duke of Normandy, King of England, A.D. 1150. On the basis of such grants as these, the Guild Corporation set about supervising the market. The legislative power rested in the General Assembly, which elected consuls, rectors, échevins, captains, wardens, provosts, doyens, as they were called in various places, and which was assisted by a council of prud'hommes and the like. As a juridical personality, the guild could do business as a unit through syndics and procurators. All of these officers were elected for very short terms, as also were the lesser internal officers concerned with the strongbox and the records. In general, in the North, the guild had no capital fund of its own. This was supplied by the members themselves for each venture. In the South, some few associations had a common capital. Three principal forms of bad practice were special objects of solicitude. A. Forestalling, which meant obtaining goods before they had been offered to all corners in the open market, for example, by going out to meet a ship or caravan. B. Regrating, which meant buying for immediate resale at a higher price in the same market. C. Engrossing, which meant obtaining a corner on the supply of a commodity in a given market. The usual penalty for forestalling was forfeiture of the goods involved to guild, town, or crown. Penalties for regrating varied widely, from expulsion to fines. Futures trading was forbidden, for speculation and monopoly were the two great dreads of the medieval businessman. Those people who buy only to sell immediately, called by the French regratiers, because they prevent an unhampered exchange, ought to be crushed by the community and exiled, wrote John Duns Scotus, died 1308, the great Franciscan scholar. The doctrine on monopoly requires careful statement. Social monopoly was essential to the structure of the system of guilds. It was regarded as normal and useful and necessary, and was taken for granted. Personal monopoly was the greatest possible economic abuse, for which no penalty was too severe. In addition to all the other preventives of monopoly, there was added the right of part, by which a merchant who had been present at a purchase by a fellow guildsman could demand a share in the bargain at the original price. Whoever buys a lot of herrings shall share them at cost price with the neighbours present at the buying. Berwick-on-Tweed, A.D. 1283. Violations of the regulations of the association were punishable usually by fine. If anyone shall do this, he himself would likewise be deprived of his guild, and may not recover it except he give 1 mark. And if he himself buys wine from Cologne, none of the brethren of the Hanse of Utrecht may drink it, but if anyone do so and be convicted thereof by 2 aldermen, he will lose his Hanse. Utrecht, A.D. 1251. Since the merchant, as a trader, was much concerned with getting his wares from abroad, problems promptly arose over the protection and maintenance of business relations in distant centers where the products of local industry were to be sold, or where commodities desired in the home market were to be bought. The problems were solved by an extension of association to agreements between guilds in different cities, to which agreements the term Hanse was applied. The Hanse, originally a tax imposed on foreigners who wished to use the local market, came to mean the agreement by which foreigners were given a certain status in the market, and finally the organization that arose out of these agreements. One such Hanse, composed at first of 17 towns of Normandy and the Low Countries, later with a membership of 60, was organized chiefly with the great fairs of Champagne in view. Footnote: explicit discussion of the fairs is omitted because, important as they were quantitatively, the fairs were governed by formulas of the same nature as were the guilds. The Flemish Hanse of London, with headquarters at Bruges, united 15 cities whose guilds were involved in the English wool trade. The German Hanseatic League numbered 70 cities dominated by Bremen, Lübeck, and Hamburg. They not only traded with each other, but also maintained houses and staffs at distant posts such as Bergen and Novgorod. The manner of these agreements and their content is indicated by the following agreement between Hamburg and Lübeck, A.D. 1241. The Advocate and Common Council of Lübeck, we have made an agreement with our beloved friends, the citizens of Hamburg. 1. That if by chance robbers or other evil men rise against our citizens or theirs from that place, where the river, which is called Trave, flows into the sea to Hamburg, and thence along the Elbe to the sea, and if they assail our citizens or theirs, whatever costs or expenses are incurred for extirpating those robbers, we ought to share with them, and they with us. 3. If any burgesses of theirs near our city of Lübeck, or our burgesses near the city of Hamburg should be ill-treated, we shall surrender the doer or doers of the deed for punishment, and they will surrender such people to us at the expense of the commune. The rise of the craft associations. Associations of artisans are found in Europe quite as early as the period in which the merchant guild becomes potent. The chandlers of Paris had a guild in 1061, and butchers' charters in the same city, dated 1134 and 1162, appeal to ancient customs, which they have enjoyed this long time. Yet the merchant guild prospered first and found a fixed place for itself. Hence, as we may regard the rise of the merchant guild as characteristic of the 12th century, so the rise of the craft guild may be taken as characteristic of the 13th, subject to all the restrictions on generalization given above. Under merchant guild impetus, the towns flourished. A more detailed division of labor became useful and necessary. The material standard of life rose, especially for the merchant classes, and, like so many kindred groups in other historical stages, they sought to stabilize business for their own benefit. At first, the merchant guilds had welcomed competent new members and had fostered the crafts. But as they grew wealthy, they sought to maintain by exclusion what they had gained by effort, service, and enterprise. Against this exclusive tendency, the crafts, by the same arguments, principles, and means that the merchants had used against the feudal authority, sought to secure their status against both lord and merchant burgher. The craft movement is broadly analogous to that of the merchants. By the terms of their charter, the Association of Artisans obtained the exclusive right to practice a certain trade within a given area, the right to make rules for their craft, and to enforce penalties. Like the burghers, they frequently were charged with the performance of public functions other than the production of their specific article. The early charters make this clear. It is decreed that there shall be 23 fishermen of worms, namely these, NN. In addition, if anyone shall be found to have bought fish to retail them between the two towns of Suinthane and Altdrupfen, or if he be taken by the said fisherman while making the said purchase, the fish will be taken from him and equally divided among the townsmen. Those who catch fish are not prohibited from selling them, but the said 23 fishermen are not allowed to buy any before the hour of prime, A.D. 1106. Henry, Duke of Normandy, be it known that I have granted and confirmed with this my charter to my tanners of Rouen, their guild, no one shall ply their craft in Rouen except with their permission, A.D. 1170. Philip, king of the Franks, the butchers of Paris came to our presence, asking that we grant and permit them to hold in peace their ancient customs, that the butchers of Paris can buy living and dead meat and whatever pertains to their craft freely and without toil within the area of Paris. No one can be a Paris butcher unless they wish to concede it of their own will, A.D. 1182. Of these three charters, one is from a bishop, one from a duke, one from a king. Others could be cited as granted by the Common Council. For example, the carpenter's charter of Richir Zegscheide in 1178, or that of the butchers of Toulon in 1237. The complexity of the relations between craft guild and feudal authority is thus well illustrated. Craft guilds spread rapidly once their star had risen. Paris had scarcely a dozen in 1180. In the reign of St. Louis, 1226 to 1270, about 100. And in 1291, more than 350 much subdivided crafts. Thus, within the lifetime of Etienne Boileau, Louis Provost of Paris, the guilds of that city increased in number 2.5 times. The 18 that were in London in 1180 had grown to 110 in 1422. These numbers are exceptionally large in cities of moderate size, such as Cologne. The average was between 25 and 35. In smaller cities, there were but 15 or 20 guilds, with some of the less numerous crafts unorganized. Yet cities as diverse as Venice and Saint-Omer had 58 and 59, respectively, at the end of the 13th century, and Florence had 73 in 1316. Entrance into the craft took place by the service of an apprenticeship. The apprentice was bound by a contract, made in his behalf by his parents, to serve a given master for a term set by the guild. 2 years for the cooks, 12 years for the choral workers. In a few cases, like that of the old clothesmen, there was no apprenticeship. The apprentice was bound to live at the master's home, and to be subject to him as one of his family. In every case, he was inclined in the domestic discipline. The master was bound to teach the youngster all that he knew of the craft. For example, at Marseille in 1248, I, Peter Bora, in good faith and without guile, place with you, Peter Faysac, weaver, my son Stephen for the purpose for learning the trade and craft of weaving. to live at your house and to do work for you from the feast of Easter next for 4 continuous years, promising by this agreement to take care to see that my son does the said work, and that he will be faithful and trustworthy in all that he does. And I, Peter Fesak, promise you, Peter Bora, that I will teach your son faithfully, and will provide food and clothing for him. Though not a member of the guild, the apprentice enjoyed its protection. Relations between master and boy were objects of guild jurisdiction. The number of apprentices was limited, usually to 1 or 2. A runaway apprentice who returned in a short time had nothing more to do than to make up the time lost. If he could show ill treatment or failure to teach on the part of the master, the latter could be deprived of the boy, and this meant a considerable investment lost in time and instruction. On the other hand, for repeated offenses, a runaway could be forever excluded from entrance into the guild. Upon the completion of the probation, the young man might have to pass an examination or present an example of his skill, but usually he became a journeyman upon the sworn statement of the master. He was now a member of the guild in full standing, bound to it as it was bound to him. Most of his fellow members were of the same grade in the guild. He was now free to bargain for his salary with any master who had need of him. After a period of a year or so, he was free to become his own master, if financially able to do so, that is, to set up and equip a shop. If he continued to work for another, having agreed upon a salary arrangement, a strict bilateral contract existed for a definite period of time, after the lapse of which the journeyman was again free to put a fair estimate on his ability. Wages did not then fluctuate widely, and the earnings of journeymen were, on the average, 2/3 to 3/4 of those of the master. The master was not a foreman or a gang boss, but the proprietor of a shop. Masters and journeymen worked side by side at an identical work in which both had the same approved standing. Combinations of masters against journeymen were forbidden and appeared only rarely, in the latter Middle Ages. Hours and methods were regulated by the guild for both masters and men. Night work was forbidden because of poor light, which meant poor work. The absence of speculation, the regularity of the demand, and the stability of the market made it possible to plan work without putting undue pressure on anybody. As in the Merchant Guild, the General Assembly was the legislative body of the corporation, and in this masters and journeymen had equal voice. Occasionally the officers were appointed by the town. Usually they were elected by the assembly for terms of a year or less, and fines were imposed for refusal to serve. Sometimes only the masters were eligible because they had most at stake. In other cases, like the fullers of Paris or the cordwainers of Exeter, masters and journeymen shared equally in the offices. Consuls, rectors, bailies, surposés, guards, eswards, jurés, aldermen, prud'hommes. The guild regulations were designed to serve 2 purposes: to protect the worker's investment in his skill, and to ensure the community a fair product at a fair price. The first end was obtained by the vigilant guarding of the monopoly on which the guild rested, and by the supervision of the market for raw materials. The second evoked rules forbidding all manner of faulty workmanship or fraud in presenting the object to the consumer. Roger Aldith was cut off from the guild and separated from the community of Leicester because he was convicted 3 times of making cloth with the woof in the middle poorer and worse than at the ends. Likewise in other guilds, and no apprentice shall cut cloth to selvage for half a year, and this is to obtain good work. And no master or journeyman may cut cloth by himself, because no man can cut cloth well alone. And whoever infringes this rule shall pay 5 solidi to the fraternity for each offense. And those who are fed at the expense of the city shall be put to work first. And he who slights them for strangers owes 5 solidi. But if the stranger be put to work, he cannot be removed as long as the master wishes to keep him. And when a master does not work hard, he owes 5 solidi, and a journeyman 2 solidi. Arras, A.D. 1236. The edict is that no dyer be so bold that he dye cloth or blankets if they have not been woven or dressed in this town under forfeit of 50 pounds, and banishment from the town. The edict is that no one be so bold, either man or woman in all this town, that he commit fraud in woolen cloth or linsey-woolsey. And let no one be so bold, either man or woman, that he commit fraud concerning his dye for the sake of money. And whoever shall trespass in any of the above edicts shall incur a forfeit of 50 pounds, and shall be banished from the town, and shall lose his craft for 1 year. And the dye maker who is party to such operations will incur a forfeit of 50 pounds, and shall be banished from the town, and shall lose his craft. Douay, A.D. 1250. As indicated by these statutes, women were admitted to those guilds in which their competence equaled that of men, and where it excelled, needlework and lace-making, for example, they had associations of their own. By such means was medieval economic control extended to production as well as to exchange, under rules designed to increase, regulate, and guarantee production while safeguarding the product. The common good was the norm of economic morality. In certain instances, at the harvest, the crafts were interdicted from work for the benefit of husbandry, and the craftsmen went into the fields so that the work might be done in time. But the agricultural worker was never admitted to the system and was only an indirect beneficiary of the Code of Fair Markets. For the rest, so did men assemble, in behalf of the common good, Utrecht, A.D. 1251, and for the sake of usefulness, Richierzeegscheide, A.D. 1178, and to provide properly for our city, Stendal, A.D. 1231.